morning. I'm Margaret Heffernan. I'm professor of practice here at the University of Bath School of Management. I've led 5 businesses. That's the practice part. And I write books and articles about how business works or doesn't. And I am really delighted to be concluding our Dean's series of webinars with Professor Emeritus Veronica Hailey, whom I think many of you will also know as the former Dean of the School of Management. Veronica spent her professional life studying organizations undergoing change, and in particular, the kind of leadership that change requires. Following the 2008 financial crisis, she produced a really outstanding series of reports with the CIPD into trust, asking where trust had gone, how organizations develop trustworthy leadership, and what the experience of trustworthy leadership is. Published in 2012, this work has really stood the test of time. But Veronica is not somebody to rest on her laurels. And as soon as companies around the world began to lock down due to the COVID epidemic, Veronica was out researching again into how leaders were handling this crisis, for which nothing had really prepared them. Live, galvanizing, and challenging, the work has revealed much about the state of organizations today and the very big challenges that they confront tomorrow. So we will not be short of things to talk about. Veronica, welcome.
Oh, welcome, Margaret, as well. No, it's great to be here. For those of you that do know me, great to be back in the School of Management and looking forward to the conversation today, Margaret.
Good. So first of all, I want to take you back to last summer when you were writing up the first wave of research into leadership during the pandemic. What were the findings that most surprised you then?
Well, I mean, I've been researching for 35 years. So I've been interviewing senior leaders for 35 years. And quite honestly, Margaret, last summer, when I started interviewing these ExCo board level directors, I was hearing some of the most inspiring stories and narratives that I've ever heard from the hundreds, probably thousands of people that I've interviewed over my career. So that was the first thing. And the second thing, of course, was that it was the deep humanity that these leaders were showing at this time. Stripped of their normal mechanisms for making decisions, often, more than often, thrown out of their normal physical surroundings and operating like we are on Zoom. The very destabilization of everything around them, curiously, seemed to bring out the best in them. And we can explore that further on, is why the trappings of power, once that's taken away, and the mechanisms that purport to give them certainty on a day-to-day basis are also taken away, then actually you suddenly see the very best of leadership. And of course, one of the challenges is how we're going to keep that going beyond the pandemic. But those are two of the things that struck me immediately.
Yeah. So what were the things that you found? I mean, I think that insight that actually when you get rid of the trappings of power, it kind of releases people to act in a different way. What do you think it is that they kind of got rid of that was perhaps a burden? And what did they find in its place that would turned out to be such a strength?
So let's think of a few pieces. So first of all, the first thing that comes to mind that really struck me, and they talked about this, is that not only in the interviews with me, but in all their dealings with the staff, certainly in the first few months, things couldn't get run through corporate communications. So they weren't operating off scripts. They weren't operating with somebody telling them how to respond, what's the right narrative, what's the branding, what's the messaging. They were actually just responding as themselves. And the second thing was that actually this technology, and I know, all of us have reached probably a point where we want to go face to face for at least some of our lives, but this technology enabled senior leaders to talk to more people at all different levels in a much more accessible way than ever before. And they were talking to them off script and actually, and they were listening to other people in a way that a Zoom screen is much more democratic than being marched into the boardroom, having flown for 12 hours to get there, put up in a hotel, made to sit outside the boardroom, clutching your presentation and then going in. You know, everything is built to be intimidating. Whereas actually, a CEO on a Zoom screen gets no bigger screen necessarily than anybody else. So you suddenly had this democratizing aspect of Zoom, and actually people loved it. So they're unscripted, they're suddenly much more available, and they're available in a sort of more democratic way. And the third thing is that they're of course sitting, as we are now, in our homes. So suddenly, instead of seeing them like the king and the court and the queen and the court, you know, you're seeing them with, I mean, there's one CEO I interviewed who I just, you know, I was quite distracted by this, but the whole way through the interview, behind him, there was his racing cycle, but actually above him on a cupboard. And I can remember thinking, crumbs, is this going to fall over? I mean, how are you keeping that upright, Joe? I mean, it was just much more relaxed, much more human. I was doing something with someone from JP Morgan the other week, and it was a board meeting. And suddenly in the midst of it, this guy's daughter ran in. You know, it was before the schools went back. And he just pulls his daughter onto his lap. And I can remember saying to him, Oliver, that's great. Good to see the diversity going up. You know, I mean, these sort of conversations wouldn't have happened before. And of course, the great thing is, how are we going to keep them going forwards? So those are three immediate things. This, I'm unscripted, I'm much more accessible. And actually, by the way, I'm human. I've got dogs, I've got cats. Some of my family have got COVID, possibly. You know, that was happening for some of them. They had very sick people, and they're suddenly seen as much more human.
Yeah. And also, I remember you saying that they seem to understand intuitively that actually being human, being empathetic, reaching out to support people, and to think about how do we support people, that seems to have occurred to most leaders. It has to be said, not all, but most leaders, without their having to be told to do this.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, it actually made people feel much more engaged and much more productive.
Yeah. So again, the big question is that why does this not normally happen? So the conditions were that they didn't have data about what was going to happen. They were dealing, as we all know, with this huge amount of ambiguity and uncertainty. And in those situations, what seemed to happen is that they came in touch with a basic morality about doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And I can remember talking to one of the chief finance officers for one of Britain's major multinationals, where he was talking to me about the decision early on that they would defer paying the dividend. And that's a big decision for a chief finance officer to make. The previous financial year had been outstanding. And we were, by this stage, of course, only a few weeks into the COVID thing. And he had to think about going to the board and obviously to the shareholders and saying, we are going to defer dividend because we do not know what is going to happen. But also, we may need cash to support supply chains. And I can remember saying to him, well, how did you make that decision? And he said, it felt like the right thing to do. Now, obviously, he took it to his colleagues at the Exco. But that's what I mean, is suddenly they were in touch with a form of morality that I don't think people, it may always be there, Margaret, but I don't think people were aware of that, and it seemed to get exposed more easily.
But I also think what's quite interesting about what you're saying is that in the absence of kind of received wisdom, which kind of, evaporated, actually everybody had to think for themselves.
Yeah.
And then they discovered that they actually could. And I think what's so interesting about this is that, to me, what it says is how far they hadn't been doing that in the past. And you see exactly the same thing in terms of, flexible working. People have been pushing for flexible working, being able to work from home for almost all of my career, but certainly for the last 20 years, because technically it's been so easy. And yet we've resisted. And yet, when suddenly everybody has to do it, it turns out, wow, people are much better at change than we thought they were. So what I think is so interesting about this is it feels like there's this whole superstructure of assumptions about people and power and how we work, which subjected to radical uncertainty, crumbled on impact, and revealed that actually the people in a lot of organizations were much smarter and more creative and more intuitive than the system had heretofore allowed them to be.
Yeah, and what I would say is there were, I interviewed 20 different organizations. I interviewed 44 people from board level, and then did another 16 to 20 people in focus groups who were human resource directors. Now, the 20 organizations that offered themselves up rapidly, I have to say, rapidly, this was extraordinary. I had to sort of close the gates because there were too many wanting to take part. A lot of those wanted to tell their story about being responsible, so in that sense, they were probably, I was probably interviewing more of the heroes than the villains. Right. But you're right that it was strange. I can remember there was one company, and I think it was the only one, that kept on saying, we've got a procedure and we've got a system. The majority of them were saying, well, we quickly realized there was no data on this and there was no algorithm, and that none of our business continuity plans had prepared us for this. Right. So yes, they had to be smart, but that smartness, that ability and competence, again, took a different form, Margaret, because the smart ones didn't just shove it through some kind of system and let go. First of all, they realized no one person had the answer. Right. So what did this mean? Well, this meant, first of all, they had to listen to each other. They had to actually, at executive level, really listen to any intelligence and any thoughts that people had. And it became a real team endeavor. But they didn't have complete information. So the second thing that happened is that the network of relationships, if they had them outside the organization, became absolutely critical. So the extent to which that you had created trusting relationships, maybe with local government, with national government, with Whitehall, with your competitors operating in Italy or Spain, who were going through this faster than you, the local community. I mean, you had to reach out and get intelligence very, very quickly. Now, people aren't going to share that unless you've built a relationship with them prior to the crisis. And then the third thing that was different about the way that they were exercised, that competence, that intelligence, that thoughtfulness, was that they also had to listen to people at the bottom of the organization in a way that they had never listened before. And sure, some of this was from a compassionate point of view. Yes, they did want to know that they were okay. One CEO told me, this was actually this year, that he had managed to speak, I think obviously via Zoom, to every single one of his employees and he's got 3,500 employees across the world, and he'd managed to somehow over the 9 months speak to everyone. He said, all I want to know is, how are you doing? Just what's it been like? Just tell me how it's been like. So some of that listening was compassion, but the other thing was they quickly realized that people at the lower levels of the organization had intelligence that they didn't have. They had knowledge. They had a sense of which branches, if you were a bank, were actually being used and which ones weren't. So how can we close some branches and divert those staff that can go into other branches? So you've got this powerful demonstration of a need to take information and knowledge very, very fast from way beyond the boardroom, and be humble in accepting that you haven't got all the answers or all the knowledge. And that was really different for them.
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, in the middle of this, Black Lives Matter happen, all sort of ostensibly out of the blue. What impact did that have?
Well, again, I would say the companies split into two groups, Margaret, over this. So those that were panicked, and I suspect slightly scared, responded, I think, in retrospect, too fast. And they responded because the problem is, if you respond to something as fundamental, as enormous as that, too fast, you run the risk of looking trivial, because it looks as though you can put a response out, you can put a black square out with your logo on, within 12 hours, as though you really understand what it means to be marginalized for centuries. And, so the people that panicked and responded too fast actually and sort of glossed it over, okay, we put a black square out with our logo, things will move on. They actually, I think, were found to trivialize it. Those that were deeply impressive were those who again said, I don't know how to respond to this. This is so big that actually I'm out of my depth. And one CEO, and it's written up in the reports that Danielle will put the links up at the end of this session. One CEO said to me, I was completely out of my depth. I did not know what to do. So what did he do? He said, oh, this is great. He said, I knew the corporate communications people didn't know what to say, that they would have no experience of how to respond to this. He said, so I had to listen, and I chose to completely sort of miss out corporate communications and go straight. He said, mainly the US communities out in LA, San Francisco, really listen to those communities. Microsoft, as you and I have discussed before, this huge day put over to every employee in Microsoft, reading, discussing, debating something on this subject. And, those that were intelligent listened, because, and the big message for me from this is, those who are included naturally cannot assume or presume to speak for those who are excluded. You cannot understand their experience unless you listen. And the intelligent ones really listened and really thought about systemic change. Now, it's going to take time, of course it is, to really change a system. But, those were the two groups. Panic, fast response, slightly trivializing the thing. This other group really listening and not assuming they knew the solutions or indeed the experience.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I've been working with a couple of American companies recently, and they are not talking about diversity anymore. they are talking about anti-racism policies.
Mm.
I mean, it's quite striking that this has shifted what they're talking about, how they're thinking about it, that all the kind of bland motherhood statements around diversity have just been thrown out the window in a kind of recognition that they're just not good enough, and that there are, decades of failure attached to the language,
Yeah.
which they've got to find other words for now, if they're going to do anything that is credible.
Well, I think, you and I have talked before about moving from a do no harm.
Right.
Okay, so I can prove that my policies and procedures do not discriminate, towards something much more fundamental, which is not just about the Black Lives Matter movement, but it goes back to this listening thing. Why are we not listening to people who have different experiences, who feel on the periphery for whatever reason? And how can we learn to be much more inclusive? And that's just, as you say, it's way beyond bland diversity statements. And I think for all of us, probably on this call, it means changing the way we see the world. I know as a woman, and you'll have had the same experiences as well, I have listened to men presume to speak about the experience of women, having never asked the women what the experience is. And, for all groups that are feeling in any way marginalized or excluded, the first thing you have to do is listen to their experience. And, that CEO who said I was out of my depth and went off to the States to listen, he said, it has changed me forever. I had no idea of the problem and the experience. And that's significant.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's also interesting, I think that, that applies to other issues, which which have not gone away in the meantime, issues around inequality, for example, of which, of course, racism is one manifestation. But, I think that the pandemic seems to have revealed a world to all of us, not just leaders, which we, frankly, had been willfully blind to. In terms of inequality, in terms of lack of opportunity, in terms of really horrible aspects of the working life, just how much people hate their commute, just how stressful they'd found a way of working, which we'd all sort of taken for granted while everybody's doing it. So it must be okay. In crises, people always blame leadership because it's, both the cause of disaster, but it's also seen as the solution to a crisis. So what do you think leaders need to be doing now that's different? So after all this intense learning, some of it, as you say, very positive, some of it kind of horrible in terms of revealing how many operating assumptions of leaders were profoundly misguided. What do we need to do now?
Well, I think there's one big thing that we've got to do. If you ask me, the one big thing we've got to do is that I think we have to retain in leadership the morality that we saw during COVID. So the problem is now, Margaret, people have seen that leaders can do the right thing and they can show compassion. But is that just for COVID? Are we all getting a retreat back?
It can't just be for Christmas, right?
Yeah, exactly. Was that just for COVID? So actually, I've seen you as deeply human. I've seen you as empathetic and compassionate. I've seen you as somebody that can listen. And I've seen you as somebody who has some humility. And I've seen you as somebody who has quite a lot of courage. Is that all going to just disappear as we go back in, okay, in hybrid form? are we going to retreat back into those algorithms? Because I think if we do that, there will be a number of difficult consequences. First of all, there'll be deep cynicism, because people have seen that there's a different way of leading. So people's expectations now are different. Secondly, and we haven't really discussed this yet, anybody who thinks the social justice issues have gone away with a vaccine, I mean, the physical health issues for those of us lucky enough to have a vaccine in this country, they may have gone away, but the social justice and the injustice that is still there in society has not gone away. Right. And there are going to be some really challenging things around grief, I think, in the workplace. The latest figures are, I think it's 3.48 million people have died during COVID. And that's masking, obviously, probably in sub-Saharan Africa and India, large numbers of deaths that are not being reported in the same way they weren't reported during the AIDS epidemic. So we're looking at millions and millions of people having died. And, a number of people are talking now about the grief that will now unfurl, because these deaths happened in unusual ways. Families weren't allowed in the West. If you were dying in a hospital, you weren't allowed in, obviously, to be with your loved ones. This is not a normal passage. It's not a normal rite of passage. It's not the way we normally deal with death. And certainly the US Society for Human Resource Management has said, you've got to prepare yourself for grieving. I was listening to a doctor speaking at a conference about actually how COVID had unlocked more compassion in doctors and nurses, Margaret, because the family weren't there. And it was only the medical staff that could help these people through their death. And that, again, the doctors had suddenly reconnected with a great deal of compassion. So there's the grief to deal with. There's the injustice of what's happened to young people. You and I both have children that have been affected by this in their 20s. We know what it's been like when they've been sitting at home, working from home, and how bizarre that has been and how unnatural. And, our kids are probably the lucky ones, but there's a whole swathe of them that aren't so lucky. And then the third thing is that, there are going to be casualties. The furlough will end. And whilst, the economy in this country may be looking at least steady, that doesn't mean it's fair for everybody. There's going to be injustice. And the couple of human resource directors said to me in much more evocative words, they said there's a lot being repressed, and there's a heck of a lot bubbling under about the resentment of who took risks, who didn't, where was reward given. I mean, there was a thing in the Financial Times the other week, I don't know whether you saw it, that the heading was something like, and this is in the Financial Times, we're not talking the New Statesman or the Guardian. The Financial Times was leading with, the CEOs don't appear to have learned their lesson. And it was, again, the amount of bonuses, of course, that CEOs were awarding themselves at the end of the year, when in fact a lot of frontline people had been taking the biggest physical risks. And then, I'm just going to chuck in a few more, Margaret. You've got health. How this just because we're vaccinated now doesn't mean it protects us against future variants. So, like SARS has technically in some ways not gone away. AIDS is still prevalent in Africa and Asia. those in public health tell me that this is, this is not going away. There is going to be a continual search for vaccines that deal with variants. So how are organizations going to think about health, and how do they make work a healthy place to be? So, I mean, gosh, I could go on, Margaret, but there are other big challenges we haven't mentioned there, but let's stop there and unpick a few of those.
Yeah. So what do you think in that context, what do you think the New Deal is at work? And, I know everyone's fixating on real estate, how many desks do I need, and all that kind of displacement activity. But in terms of what the organization needs, which is to keep a lot of that connectedness, responsiveness, contribution, participation, empathy, that sort of thing. It's what the organization needs. And what people need is a lot of that humanity and an ability to participate and to contribute. But what else do they need? Because it feels to me like the kind of basic social contract at work has shifted, because it used to be, we're going to pay you this and you're going to do whatever we tell you to. And if it means you have to get up at 4:42 every morning to catch the train, to be here on time, to do the pre-breakfast meetings, well, that's just too bad, right? So very kind of top down, very imperious, very rigid, loaded with bureaucracy, KPIs and targets. If you don't get those, you don't get your bonus. And no, the salary itself isn't actually all that great, because we think we should really only incentivize you by hope for money or fear of not getting money. It seems to me all of that's got to go, because it's kind of deadly in terms of the energy that you're talking about that was really released during this. So what takes its place?
Well, I think, again, those that are intelligent and wise, let's use wise as a word, not intelligent, but wise, realize that actually there's just got to be a complete recalibration of what work looks like. I mean, hybrid, we got, I would maintain a view that we got through in the UK, in most of the employment places, we got through COVID because people traded off. This is what one managing director said to me, direct quote, we traded off historic goodwill. All right. So they'd got trust or goodwill in the bank, Margaret, and they pulled that down in swathes during this year. Those stocks are pretty depleted. Now, we are, as you say, we are not going back to where it was. And therefore, I think what you're implying, and I would agree with you, is that those employers who are really wise will take this time to recalibrate the employment relationship. And that is, as you say, on what terms will I give you my commitment and my engagement? And what am I going to get back in return? Now, on one level, that might be flexible working. But I think that's just the superficial level. I think what you're talking about is a much bigger calibration. For instance, can you guarantee, in the same way that, can you guarantee that I'm going to be healthy and safe at work? Now, that's the same kind of contract that was being negotiated in the 19th century with factory owners, where they just went, enough. You cannot have this number of casualties in your factories, in your mills. You cannot have children, working 12 hours. Now, I think we're in a situation where potentially that will need to be recalibrated. And I think those that have traditionally missed out of the previous employment contract are also going to get extremely angry if society does not think about how we bring those people into being active citizens, in work, paying tax, with skills, with training, with opportunities. Right. So there is so much to do. And I think from those that have come through the pandemic well, which have been the tech companies and other companies, we should expect more. We should expect a lot from those companies in terms of rethinking what employment is about and putting pressure on governments to balance out inequality and injustice. We've got to get people, you can't carry on with a gig economy where you look at the gig economy, well, in India, the consequences of people not having social support, of operating in a casual labor situation. When the workplaces were closed in India, there was no support for them. And they either walked back to their villages or they actually had to find somebody who would break the law and give them some money. Now, the consequences that COVID's gone insane in India. We've got to tackle these big issues because they have consequences for absolutely everybody. And I don't want my children and grandchildren to grow up in a society where inequality and pay differentials, if they carry on as they are just taking us back into something that's historic. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean,
it's big. It's big.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, I think that, for me, the gazillion-dollar question is, will we confront those what feel like really burning issues right now? Or will we do what we did after the financial crisis, which is to do just enough to keep the trains running, as it were? So we'll do the technical fix in the same way that, after the financial crisis, we did kind of capital requirements, which was the technical fix.
Yeah.
And there was all this other cultural stuff, which we knew was really fundamental. And mostly we talked about it and we talked about it and we talked about it. And then basically most leadership teams pretty much ran away screaming because they couldn't really figure out culture was too difficult. It was too ambiguous. You couldn't get your heads around it. And actually top-down management had always worked in the past. And so, well, let's just kind of go back to what's familiar. I mean, my big fear is we will miss the point again. And that will be a sense of, well, the pandemic's over, so everything's okay. The difficulty, of course, is everything isn't okay. There isn't an economist in the world who knows actually how to manage where we are, right? Because it's so unknown. So everybody's arguing with total certainty that they're right, but actually nobody knows. So we've got probably an economic crisis, at least of theoretical confusion, right? We have, as you eloquently pointed out, an inequality crisis. And we are, in case anybody's forgotten, we're already in a climate crisis, which will make the pandemic look like a kind of simple dress rehearsal. So how confident do you feel that the profound learning that you've researced and evidenced is actually going to stick?
Okay. So you and I have discussed this before, and you're the slightly more pessimistic, and I'm always the optimist, Veronica. Always looking on the bright side. So first of all, one of the ways I'm going to not let this go is that my research carries on. My reports will carry on. We are producing another 3 reports later this year. It's planned for publication in November, and we're going out for data collection to repeat going back into the companies that we were working with before. So I'm not going to let the debate or the commentary go away. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think what we've got to understand is that this is very difficult. The reason why people really don't rethink in a truly transformational way is that it is incredibly difficult to reimagine a world when you have only grown up in one world. Now, if you look around World Economic Forum or whatever, what a lot of attention is being given to, and this is really relevant for the School of Management, a lot of attention is being given to how young people are reimagining the world. And I think one of the initiatives that CEOs and all their other C-suite colleagues can do is in an engagement with the young people, not just those in their organizations, but entrepreneurs, etc., who have an energy and a commitment to make the world different, and have far greater ideas and imagination often than the CEOs. Now, they may not have the wisdom to make those ideas happen. If you're in a Unilever or a Microsoft or whatever, you might still want that wisdom that comes from experience and knowledge. But actually, I suspect the imagination and the creativity can come from young people. And I commend to everybody, you know, firstly, work with your students on this, get their creativity and imagination going. But the other thing is look around, you know, the big foundations, as I was looking at yesterday, Margaret, that are the fellows, the Atlantic fellows, the World Economic Forum fellows there. I mean, they've got amazing podcasts going on of people completely reimagining this world. And that's, I think, a major commitment. The third thing, which not many people talk about, is that if people really try and reimagine this and try and address some of the social justice issues, then people are going to make mistakes and things are going to go wrong and there's going to be error and failure. Because if you're innovating, as the scientists and engineers will tell us who are just sitting somewhere else on campus, they will tell you that when you are reinventing something, you're really innovating, things go wrong. You have pilots, things go wrong. Now, therefore, I think the rest of us have got to cut some blooming slack to those that try and do something really different. If it goes wrong in the first instance, don't do the, well, I knew it would never work. You know, just go back to the cupboard of denial. We'll go back to command and control. If you say it's always worked. So how are we going to respond to experimentation? And how, for instance, Margaret, how are people like you and I going to get behind boards and companies and help them actually rethink? And some of the work that both you and I do at the Ford Institute, where I'm now working, is about generating a new generation of leaders who think differently, who explore, who are curious, who are humble, who listen to people from all around the society. And all we can, each of us, do is try and make those connections between sources of creativity and of imagination, support those who want to do things in a more moral and just way. That's what I think we can do. But I'm not completely naive, Margaret. There will be those who are just rubbing their hands in glee and things will go back to normal. And then the last thing is, therefore, what is the role of government? And where are governments going to play a part in actually trying to tackle some of these issues, etc., etc. Right, I'm conscious of time now.
So we've had a very good question here, which is, you know, in the consequence of in the light of everything that you've just said, and bearing in mind that we're talking to quite a lot of alumni and students right now, what advice would you give them for this new world, especially if they're in or aspiring to leadership positions? What should they be doing, learning, paying attention to, thinking about?
Okay. So I've been doing a lot of listening to conferences, reading around a new movement that is coming into various areas, funnily enough, not from the business schools for the most part. And this is a movement around character and character in leadership. And I'm working at the moment with the University of Oxford on something called the Oxford Character Project. And let me just tell everybody, it was new to me, so I've been reading around in a new way. But there are a lot of conversations going on in law, in medicine, in tech, as well as business, about how can we create and develop and give spaces where leaders with character can actually come up to the top. Now, what does this mean for all the alumni and the students? What they mean by character is people who have, and they characterize it into two forms. One, intellectual abilities to think widely, be curious, and to not assume that they have all the answers. That's an intellectual compass. And the other one is a moral compass. And the moral compass that they talk about is humility, courage, compassion, and empathy. And what they are saying is that whether you're a doctor or whether you're running an engineering tech company or whether you're a lawyer, it's no longer sufficient for you to have just great technical skills. That actually what has come out of COVID is that those that led well were those with a personal moral compass and an intellectual curiosity and ability to still learn and listen that enabled them to lead well. And so what I would say to the alumni and students here is ask what the School of Management are doing about that. We've always done far more than other business schools in this area around responsible business management. But also think about how you might develop yourself as a leader with those extra competencies, because I think they are going to be probably the thing we're talking about in about 6 or 9 months' time. So have a look at the Oxford Character Project, interdisciplinary project using divinity scholars, philosophers, psychologists, you know, very, very interesting smorgasbord of minds being brought together to think about leadership. Very interesting that a lot of it is not coming from the business schools. It's coming from other disciplines.
And I would have to say as a counter argument that I've seen institutions that have focused on character intensely, and that has not protected them from gross abuse, scandal, corruption, terrible, terrible leadership. So I think character matters. I think the idea that it's a panacea, it reminds me a little bit of, when the QC Dinah Rose did her investigation into how did the Jimmy Savile thing happen during his time at the BBC. And she recommended that the BBC should go out of its way to hire people with, good character and high moral standards. To which the obvious answer was, well, first of all, doesn't everybody want to hire those people? Secondly, where on earth do you find them? And third, how do you know? There's no blood test for character. There's no blood test for high ethical standards. And we all think we know it when we see it, but that's because it looks like us. So I think, I buy the notion of character as being important, but I also think that the kinds of structures and rules and boundaries that we put around organizations and laws, for that matter, have a huge role to play. I can tell you that the minute you work people 95 hours a week, for example, whatever character they had is mush by the end of the week.
So I wouldn't say that character on its own, Margaret, would do things. And if you look at the tech and the problems that we've got with the tech industry, where you have got a lot of leaders who have almost ended up with power that in some ways is quite surprising to them, you're going to have some kind of government intervention there to write the, not write, but to monitor and contain the incredible power that those people are or have within society to make or break society. So I would completely agree with you that character on its own won't solve anything, but I do believe that actually encouraging people to think beyond their technical or professional skills and to apply a morality based on compassion can't but help.
Yeah, no, of course, I would completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things, that I've always loved about your work is that you don't write about leadership purely from an abstract or a theoretical perspective. You have been a leader, most recently here at the School of Management. And I just wondered, in your view, what is the very hardest aspect of leadership as you have practiced it?
I think the very hardest aspect is sometimes sitting on information or intelligence that you have that makes the situation more complex than you are allowed to explain to your staff. And some of the faculty or professional service staff from the school, maybe on this this webinar, and at times when I was I'd had 7 years on the university exec, at times there is information. It's always the case. There is information sometimes. Perhaps the government will say, we will give you this information, but it's not yet for public dissemination, but we're just telling you, what the funding round's likely to be, et cetera, et cetera. You sit on information that means that the context in which you're taking decisions is much, much more difficult than you can explain to people. And therefore, you can appear to be making trade-offs that are inexplicable to people. And I used to find that very hard. I mean, I'm quite an open and transparent person. I hope that I always treated people with dignity and respect and a right to have as much information as I could possibly supply to them. But that was the thing that I used to find difficult. And therefore, sometimes it's difficult to understand the complexities and the trade-offs that senior managers have to make. One does one's best. I think the second thing is, people are very judgmental. I think people can be very judgmental. And as I said, if you really wanted to change things, leaders make mistakes. Any leader who really wants to make a difference and not just, crank the wheel and keep things going. If you really want to make a difference and try something different and innovate, you are going to make mistakes. And there's always a collection of people who can be a bit holier than, oh, look at what she's trying now, my God. And you sort of think, well, on the one hand, you want some change. On the other hand, you want me to have the perfect solution before we even take one step forward. And that is about the responsibility of all of us as followers. And that's what we were talking about. You want to see transformation, you're going to have to suspend a bit of judgment every now and then and go, whoa, Veronica, Margaret, she made a bit of a mess over that, but she's doing pretty well there. So let's stick with her. Those are the things I found difficult.
Yeah. And I'm interested, that you're talking about leadership is, Veronica and Margaret, but the truth remains, as far as diversity is concerned, that there actually aren't a lot of Veronica and Margarets running major institutions, major companies, and so on. In the light of the crisis we're hopefully emerging from, and the crises that we're heading into, do you think this is good, bad, or indifferent as far as our need to redress social ills are concerned?
Well, again, I think it was the Financial Times or the Economist were actually showing that appointments of women to senior posts during COVID has actually been negative. It's been going down, which I think is extraordinary. So it's a sort of somber tone after all that we've talked about. that why they're not getting promoted up. I mean, it's again, it's about where does intelligence lie? Where does wisdom lie? Where does experience lie? And actually, to understand 50% of the world's population is actually female, and you've got large numbers of females in the working population now. And they've been through an extraordinary thing with children and balancing homeschooling and everything. It seems extremely retrograde that we should be going backwards in terms of women making it to the top. I mean, I know that university has a major diversity and inclusion initiative led by the Vice Chancellor and Rajni and Alex Butler, and good news. Because, you know, when I was at the university, we were taking equal numbers in to the lower levels of the university, but they were not getting up to the top. And that's not through a lack of intelligence, wisdom, or experience. There's something else going on. And the university would not be atypical from other organizations. So a bit like the Black Lives Matter, just find out what is going on, what is the form of exclusion that's going on.
Right. So we're rapidly running out of time. There are only about 1 million other questions I would like to ask you. What is it that makes you such an optimist?
Oh, because I believe people are basically good. I think the reason I came into this area is because when I left university, well, before I left university, I'd done loads of temping jobs. When I left university, I had a sort of couple of major jobs, and, you know, became a manager in charge of, I don't know, 21 people by the time I was 25. And basically, Margaret, what I realized is it's a bit like a child being born, isn't it? I mean, you know, child comes into the world innocent and, you know, hoping for the best. People actually enter the workplace hoping, I think, for the best. And then what we do with them in those workplaces, in our economies, actually makes or shapes them as people. It makes or shapes them as children, their children. It makes or shapes society. So I really care about people, and I believe everyone should be given a chance to achieve their full potential. And I believe that people dealt with in a moral, compassionate and empathetic way can be allowed to do that. And that's why leadership in workplaces really matters to me.
Veronica, Hope, Hailey, thank you. There is so much more to say on this subject, and I hope we'll have another opportunity to explore your research and see what it shows up next at some point in the future. In the meantime, I'm sad to say that this is the last of our Dean's webinars for this academic year. I would like to thank the small army of people behind the scenes who brought these events to life, to thank the outstanding scholars and researchers who shared their knowledge with us, and to thank all of you for joining and to contributing to all of these events. It's a challenging world we live in right now. So it doesn't seem entirely inappropriate to end with words more routinely saved for television drama. Thank you, and be careful out there.